I do want to give an introduction to the Grange because I think it is interesting, especially when we're discussing the issue of women in fraternal societies. Um, just by its nature, the definition fraternal makes you think of obviously men only or male dominated. And we would use that word sorority if we were talking about a women's institution. But what do you call an institution that from birth has had both genders? Well, I call it the Grange. So um, let me give you a little brief history. As you know, the Freemasons and Masonry as an organization has dated back centuries. And then, came rise to other organizations, one of which included one that will next year celebrate its 200th year, which is the Odd Fellows that was founded in Baltimore. So, between the Masons and the Odd Fellows in the U.S., there was already a culture here of this fraternal system that did all the things that the previous speakers had talked about. Connecting people to civic engagement and civil society, providing benefits to members, providing the ability to network, all of those things that were very important in building the America that we know was that 18th and 19th century America. And so as westward expansion began happening and as the Civil War started, raged, and then was won, or at least ended, depending on where you live in the country, there was the look at where we were then. So 1867 is where I'll pick up this story. In 1867, a man named Oliver Hudson Kelley was, well, at the time, he was kind of just a clerk here in D.C., and he was sent to go through the South and learn about what the conditions were of the farms and of farming. Because, of course, as we talked a little bit about, and what one of our predecessors talked about, was the areas were being raised, not just by the war, which we know, but also by just the change in what that economy would look like. The South has always been very agrarian. The soil is rich, the soil is deep, the ability to, grow and produce so well is there. And so after this war, the federal government wanted to understand what it would take to make sure that we had that production and scale in order to deal with these millions of immigrants that were starting to enter the U.S. and the people that had been here already. And the man who was sent was Oliver Hudson Kelley. Kelley is an interesting figure. He was a Bostonian by birth, and he went to Minnesota. He and his wife were, farming there, and he, similar, I think, to some of these other folks, was not always great at it, and so he found work off the farm often, and that work took him to D.C. in doing some of these, clerical jobs and different things. And so as he traveled through the South, he was very much, with his Boston accent, seen as a carpetbagger. And I guess you can assume that his introduction into these communities to ask farmers, what it looked like to be on their farm at that time was not terribly welcoming. And so he found his inroad because he was a Mason. And so as he went from town to town, he talked to the Masons who were there, and they allowed him entry into their own discussions if they indeed farmed or had, some interest in farming, but also to their neighbors and friends who were the farmers to talk about what the state of agriculture was. And it was in these travels that his diaries show that he came up with this idea that, we understand that the country is fractured. We understand that this needs to get better in order for progress to happen, in order for civil society to go beyond just a town or a state, but back to this national scope. And so he began thinking about the idea of a fraternity for farmers. And he was in direct correspondence with his niece, Carolyn Hall, who was still in Minnesota and helping out with the family farm there, as she was known to do. And she had done a lot of different things in her life, also coming from the Northeast, then farming, then going back to the Northeast and going back onto farms. And as you've talked about with other folks of this day, their lives were often in transition, either to help families or to grow their own family or to just, be able to stake out their claim during this westward expansion time and all of those things. So she was at that time working closely with his wife, and they began correspondence about this idea that he had of a fraternity. And she said from moment one, "You will never succeed if you do not from day one include women with equal voice and equal vote in your ranks." And that was because she knew that she and his wife and his daughters were on the farm farming. And she knew that in the South, during the war, there was no getaway. In the North, a lot of times, if you had a father, he could stay on the farm while the sons were expected to go to war. You got a pass, if you were a farmer, right? Because you were feeding the troops. But if you were in the South, it was all hands on deck. It was all men to the field. And by that, I mean field of battle, not field of agriculture. And so the women had been left to tend to these farms, to make decisions for their homes and their communities. And while not empowered in the way that we're going to talk about with Rosie the Riveter and, the 1970s, later women's movement and the different waves of feminism, but empowered just the same, these women would not be able to be ignored and left voiceless in yet another fraternity. And so from day one, she insisted that this was going to be the way for this fraternity to, stake its claim. So for farm families, as I'm sorry, I completely forgot your name. Teresa's talked about with the Engels presentation, which if you all have watched Little House on the Prairie, you may only know the Grange reference from there. I get that often enough. As Teresa talked about, there were not a ton of social opportunities for folks, especially far-flung in rural areas with acreage between them. With horse and buggy to carry them to and from the towns that were often, far away. There weren't movie theaters and there weren't social houses, and dearly there were not bars. There might have been, but you would definitely not have found women in them, and you may not have found your most reputable men in them either. And so the society and the culture was so different, and to expect that yet another fraternity comes up and deals just with the farm men who oftentimes aren't there farming just seemed strange to her. And so when Kelly came back to D.C., he began working with 6 other men who are often referred to as our founders. And of those 7 men total, 5 of them have roots in other fraternal societies, 3 of which are Masons and 2 are Oddfellows. In fact, the one that wrote our ritualism and our ritual degree work was a writer of Oddfellow work, and I have one of his books from that time. I think that's really interesting that you have someone who is so influential in both societies, preparing something for men only in one place and for women and men in another. I want to take a pause for a second from the history and read something. Now, our ritual work, just like most, hasn't changed much. It has certainly adapted a bit, right? But it hasn't changed a ton. And so the first thing I wanted to read to you is in the first degree. For the Masons in the room or the folks who study Masonic culture, you know that there are 32 degrees. In the Grange, there are 7. That is it. We can't count much higher. Don't get us there. The first 4 were what it took to be a full-fledged Grange member, and they were based on the seasons. And so typically, while you may enter at any time of the year, you would see your first degree in spring, and your second in summer, third in fall, fourth in winter. And so you see where we're going here. I think that that's interesting because if you were walking in 1867, or really when the Grange started a big boom in 1872 and 1873, when farmers were finding themselves at odds with the railroad barons and finding themselves politically alienated from a society that was going back, to ways that were more focused on what we now call the Beltway. That's when the Grange really picked up steam, and we had chapters, thousands, organizing in a year. So you're walking into a room, blindfolded or not, depending if you were going by the ritual manual, and you know that you're there with women by your side. And as a man, that must seem very interesting, and you're wondering what in the world are they going to bring to your organization here. And as a woman, you too are wondering what is your place. And so I really like to just point out a couple things. In your first degree, so which would be basically your first meeting space, your first interaction with the Grange, the chaplain during their, which could be his or her, part, says, "Worthy brothers and sisters, agriculture is the first and noblest of occupations. It is the only one directly instituted by our Creator. God planted the Garden of Eden and placed man therein to tend and keep it. He caused to spring forth out of the ground every tree and plant and pleasant to the sight, and bearing fruit good for food. It was the command of the Almighty that man should till the ground. History proves that where agriculture has been fostered, that nation has prospered and reached a high degree of perfection. But where it has been neglected, degeneracy begin. Let us heed the warning and escape the doom. Worthy sisters, the interests, the social relations, and the destiny of man and woman are identical. She was intended by our Creator to be the helpmeet, companion, and equal of man, the perfecting half added to his hemisphere, thus completing the full globed orb of our common humanity. Hence, as one, each shares the glory or the shame of the other." So I thought that was really one of the first moments in this organization. You see your place. And that, I think, is kind of inspiring to know that this is almost unchanged for 150 years. The second thing is, as the Grange was envisioned, very similar to the lines that you talk about in some of these other fraternal societies, there are multiple offices put into place. And in the Grange, there are 13. So remember I told you we can't count above 7. We might be able to count to 13. You are required to have at least 13 people in order to start a Grange, and at least half of them now, so 6, need to be women. The expectation is that the two genders speaking, talking, dialoguing together, creating resolutions, and preparing their advocacy, will do so in a way that is most beneficial for all in society, not just some. And so in these offices, there are 4 that were exclusively held just for women, and today they remain the same. While there are a few Granges very similar to the presentation we heard earlier this morning, where there are some Masonic lodges that do bring in women today, even though as a general rule, the Masons is a male society. There are a few Granges that, as a national representative, I've heard that have had either these positions held by men or folks who are choosing to not gender themselves in traditional ways, or just not fill them in these same ways. There are 4 positions held just for women out of the 13. And then from day one, every position could be held by women. Women had the equal voice, equal vote, and equal right to any office. Now that sounds wonderful, but I will tell you it took us 148 years to get our first female national president, so, We thought we were going to have 2 in the same year. We thought we were going to have, Clinton in the office and Betsy Huber in our office, and it would have been us looking directly across the lawn because our building basically overlooks the White House. We're on 1616H. But it was not to be, so we have one, and we're trying it out. We'll let them know how it goes. But these offices that are specifically held for women, one is called the Lady Assistant Steward. She helps bring these candidates, these new potential members, into the fore and explains to them what their duties, expectations, responsibilities as Grange members are, which I think is nice. And she prepared them for that ritualistic work that would be done, those introductions and installations. And then there are the 3 others that are called generally the Graces, and it's Ceres, Pomona, and Flora. And it's because, well, Maybe I'll read it. All right, so in the installation ceremony for these, which is fairly short, worthy sisters, the ancients worshipped Ceres, Pomona, and Flora, who represent cereals, fruits, and flowers. In the Grange, only women may hold these offices. In asking you to grace our meetings, we show our respect for women and the history of agriculture. Selected as Ceres, you have the opportunity to encourage your fellow Grangers to be persistent in their work. And it goes on. In greeting you as Pomona, I place this fruit in your care. Remember that no trees bear fruit in autumn that do not blossom in the spring. Let us remind all to cultivate youth, helping them to become educated, responsible, and involved adults. And finally, in welcoming you as Flora, let me remind you that you represent the many colors and fragrances of flowers, one of the Creator's most beautiful expressions of his goodness and influence. Take these flowers and urge others to fill their homes with beauty, joy, and love. Notice also it didn't say urge other women to fill their homes with beauty and love, but others. And so I think it's really interesting because these women in our position, in fact, this is set up perfectly almost as a Grange Hall. I would be standing in what is the master's position, and these folks over here would be our executive committee. Over there we would have the treasurer and the secretary, and right here at the central focus of the room are these three graces. One of their other responsibilities that's not written specifically in here, but is written in a lot of those secondary texts, is that they were to keep decorum in the room. Because you've got a bunch of farmers, they've had a long day. I mean, they might bring in their boots and get them all, dusty and muddy on the carpet, or they might start cursing each other, which is absolutely unbecoming of a gentleman in this society, right? And so it was really interesting to see that the prominence was placed on these women, holding a specific expectation of everyone in the room. I think what else is interesting as far as some of the roots of this is that some folks have argued that women were only made a part and an equal part because that meant that they could come and they could do the chicken degree, as you talked about earlier, that they could be the ones, cleaning the hall and setting it up and preparing the food because you wouldn't have had time for a meal if you went from field to Grange Hall. But in those very, very initial days, we never see discussion about Granges having halls. I assume it was an expectation that if this thing did get off the ground, that they would look similar to the Masons or the Oddfellows who were building buildings, that were bringing to communities these spaces. But nowhere is it written that there would be halls in those very initial conversations, but it was written that the women would be there. The other reason I think that that's kind of a little outside of what I would argue is that there's the female who is helping the steward, but the steward is not the one who's the male. Remember, there's a steward, there's a lady assistant steward and an assistant steward. And the lady assistant steward is helping bring in the new female candidates and talking to the females who are entering the room about what it is to be a Granger. She's not the one who has to make sure that all of the implements come to the meeting or that the meeting room is tidy by the end of the evening. That's the steward's job. Now, granted, he has helpers and he will direct others who will assist, but that's the steward's responsibility to make sure that this is a kept place. I think that's interesting. And surely men may not have starved on their own. Surely, women did come because they might be bringing the food, bringing the meal, but in your other rooms where you had men only, the men did not starve there either. And so there was ways to have women associated with, for example, a Mason's or an Oddfellows room, but not in it, whereas you had the women voice and vote in the room from the beginning. And if they did indeed have what we would call a potluck today, before or after that, or even as a recess during those meetings, those women, had already been able to vote that we're not going to have one of these next week because I'm sick of cooking. They had the ability, they had the responsibility to be able to speak on behalf of themselves and their sisters in this organization. So I think that was really an interesting way of talking about this being not just a nod to equality, but actual equality or expectation thereof. In Granges, it's very, very common that you see that men were helping in these early days. Yes, they were doing some of the more masculine things. For example, when Granges took on assisting communities with getting rural electrification to homes, Grange members were sometimes actually digging where the posts would go and putting in the lumber that would become those power lines. And clearly the women were not doing that. They may have been cooking the meal and preparing something for the men who were doing it. But they had voted just the same that they would be part of that assistance, that they would, as a family, help fund that initiative. And so while there were clear gender roles, if there was a man who was unable to dig a fence post, you see in some of these writings that the men assisted with certain chores or tasks that you may see otherwise just done by women in these other organizations. I think, again, what's interesting is last year we celebrated our 150th year, and we're at this moment where we are all sitting here talking about this gender issue. One of our bastions of gender division, but for good reason, right, has just come under fire with the Boy Scouts, now choosing to just be the Scouts. This year we celebrate our 130th year of the Junior Grange. From 1888, when the Junior Grange was established, it was for boys and girls. Grange members were some of the ones who helped to found what then were corn growers or tomato growers clubs, but became 4-H clubs, as they evolved and networked together and went under the cooperative system. And the boys were expected a curriculum of agriculture and of production. And the girls were expected a curriculum of hostessing and of needlework and homemaking skills. But the Junior Grange, didn't divide them that way. And the same with FFA. The Grange was one of those founding partners of the FFA, which didn't include women until past my father's time in FFA in the late 1960s. And today you still see them in skirts without specific abilities to, choose to do something that looks more equal. And so I think it's really, really interesting to think about the fact that even the things that were spurred out of Grange ideas, outside of the Grange as a structure, that had equality as its core principle. Faith, hope, charity, fidelity are those 4 lessons of the first 4 degrees, but every one of them, I think, are really underscored by this idea of equality. Anyway, but those things that are founded then outside in the society around Grange don't always show the equality that was in those halls. But Grange itself has remained committed to that principle, and I think that is fascinating. I have 1 or 2 more minutes, and so I just wanted to give you a couple quick pieces of news. Like I said, we're 150 years old, and we are a 130-year-old Junior Grange. And in that, we have collected and amassed a ton of things in our archives. And of course, we've also forgotten the fact that we are important in so many ways. And so we've gotten rid of or let time take its toll on a lot of things that would be really integral to telling our story. We have records and catalogs in different university libraries, like in Cornell or Penn State or in Kansas. But here in our National Grange building at 1616H, we also have a bunch of stuff in our archives in the basement without the ability to really understand, conceptualize, or go through. And with a really small staff, none of which have the expertise to do that deep dig and research, put into context, and also, create displays or somehow archive these things in ways that will last. And so as you're doing research, if you feel that there is some way that looking at the Grange, whether for female, issues, for gender issues, or just in general for understanding a very different type of sorority or fraternity that's happening at the same time that some of these others are, we would really welcome you to consider helping us learn a little bit about ourselves, and we can help the world learn a little bit more about the Grange. Thank you very much for having me today, and I'm happy to take a question or two. Ma'am. I hope I didn't talk too fast. Yes, ma'am. So from the very beginning, nonpartisan, we do not endorse candidates, but we do advocacy, religious but non-sectarian. So you have farmers coming in from all different backgrounds, and it was open and the same, and it still is today. In any Grange meeting, in order for it to be lawful, you have to have an American flag and an open Bible. However, it doesn't limit it to a Bible. You can have an open Bible, open Torah, open Quran, upside down, whatever. It really doesn't matter. The idea is as long as faith, hope, charity, and fidelity are part of that consciousness that that's important. And the other thing I failed, I think, to say was that, you know, as that nonpartisan, non-sectarian, kind of open society that we are, there's also the 14 is our mark for adulthood. Think about farm families, especially at that time. You become a full-fledged adult subordinate Grange member at 14, and you can be a junior from 5 to 14. So.
One would have to add that the sixth degree, how shall I put it, involves death,
Mm-hmm.
which many master masons would be acquainted with. And then in the seventh degree, you're, I don't want to sound colloquial, but you're in heaven, in a way.
Yeah, there's a part of that. And actually, the seventh degree, a lot of folks, when they talk about the focus on the goddess and the nature and Mother Nature and the female aspect, which I think is really interesting. Of course, not everyone who experiences Grange goes through every degree level, just like with every other society. But if someone does, I think they would find that really interesting, that it's played throughout every one of our degrees.
Very allegorical. One can imagine how Victorian it was, but a lot of very secular people now find the degrees interesting.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And they're put on a huge scale sometimes.
And I think, especially if you're looking back at the time, these were really the only plays, the only, artifacts of what would be acceptable cultural expressions at that time.
Together the last 2 days, the ritual work in the past has been very much the purview of a supreme officer called the High Priest of Benefer. And early, the High Priest was gifted things by a collateral house of Savoy, the kings of Italy, Duke, and we were just talking about where all these things were.
Gems and scepters and things, right?
Imposing if you were to run around K Street in them. We may even investigate that.
Yes.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I'll be here for a little bit if you have any questions.